Greetings, my dear viewers. It is I, Drayon, and welcome back to Pathfinder Hero Frame, where we take a look at the different ancestries within Pathfinder 2nd Edition and see what different types of characters are possible to make using the lore of those ancestries. And today we are taking a look at our very first common ancestry, the Dwarves. Now, surprisingly, there isn't much of a difference in the lore between Pathfinder 2nd Edition and Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition. They're relatively the same type of dwarf. They have a creator god who forged them out of rocks. They have beef with certain races, like the orcs, and they are miners and metal forgers. There are a couple of differences. Not many, but a couple. The main difference is this image here on the right, which is known as the clan dagger. It's kind of weird, but has very good cultural significance. A clan dagger is forged when a dwarf is been conceived. During the female dwarf's pregnancy, the two dwarven parents will forge this dagger, with the clan's gem embedded somewhere on the hilt. And this dagger is used to cut the umbilical cord once the dwarf baby is born. This dagger is the first weapon to take that newborn dwarf's blood. And I gotta get behind this. Like, it's interesting. It's a neat cultural detail. And each dwarf has their own clan dagger, and it is taboo to lose or even sell it. This is kind of a way to identify you as a member of a particular clan, but also to identify you as a loyal dwarf, I think. That's what I'm getting from it. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into what the dwarves are. Like I said, the dwarves were created by the very first dwarven god, Torag. I think that's how it's pronounced. But Torag crafted the first dwarves out of stone and filled their bellies with the fires of creation. Like I said, it's very similar to Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition's origins, but with some differences to actually make them unique. So anyway, with the dwarves, we have a bunch of different heritages. We have Ancient Blooded, Anvil, Death Warden, Elemental Heart, Forge Blessed, Oath Keeper, Rock, Strong Blooded. And for backgrounds, the ones that were listed for the dwarf were the Acolyte, the Artisan, the Merchant, Miner, and the Warrior, all which make perfect sense. For this video, I would like to add some of my own that I think makes sense as well. For example, I don't know why the alloy smith was not mentioned in this list. It probably should have been one of the first ones mentioned, since they are master artisans, weapon forgers, and armor forgers. So it only makes sense that they would need alloy smiths to make sure they have the raw material condensed down into actually usable material. Next are your nomads. Probably a rarer background, but one I think would fit for some of these dwarves. Not many of them. Most of them are going to be either in the mountains or under the earth, but there are some that travel the wilderness, so are actually nomadic. Very few, like probably 1 or 2 clans, but there are a couple. Next is your raised by belief, which, yeah, it's kind of obvious. You are being raised by the belief of the dwarves. You're going to know each one of the different gods and probably even be raised to serve Torag or even one of the other gods in the Dwarven Pantheon. Next is, we have 2 different ones because both of these backgrounds go off of another piece of cultural significance within Dwarven society. When it comes to naming a newborn dwarf, the parents will often pick a name of a very famous dwarf, like a dwarven hero or someone of great significance. They will name their child after that dwarf, which ends up putting a lot of pressure on these children. It's kind of like in today's society when we are naming our children after famous individuals or even other members of our family who have passed. We are putting pressure on these children to live up to the expectation of that name. So the child of notoriety and local scion would make sense for these dwarves. The child of notoriety is technically named after a particularly infamous individual, but considering that any race can have its share of villainy within their history, it still sort of makes sense to have a child of notoriety. Next is the classes. The ones that were listed were the Barbarian, Druid, Cleric, Fighter, Monk, and Ranger. Now, without much further ado, let's take a deeper look into the dwarf ancestry and see what different subclasses could work for these characters. Starting things off with the Alchemist, and you would probably think that this is a poor choice, but with the field research Bomber, we actually have a very decent dwarf for mining operations. As you well know, there is a technique of mining that uses explosives, and honestly, I think that since some of the dwarves within Pathfinder 2nd Edition are stated to use firearms, it would make sense for at least a handful of them to be bombers. I almost went for the toxicologist, but all of the poisons there were more of a type of weapon add-on than it would be for a sneaky reference to alcohol, so I decided to skip on it. Moving on to our Barbarian, there are 3 instincts that I think would work well with the dwarves. The first one is the Elemental Barbarian, and that would be with the elements of earth, fire, and metal. The second would be Fury. And the last one is more of a stretch and goes with a subcategory of dwarves known as the... I'm going to butcher this name, so apologies. The Hringar. Hringar. Pathfinder's version of the Duergar. They actually go by Duergar more often than not, but I wanted to make sure to have the actual cultural term. That way you all know that term. Much like in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the Hringa have the rare chance of having the ability to increase their size. So, I decided to pick the Instinct of the Giant to sort of reference the Hringa's ability to grow in size whenever they see fit. Now, keep a note on these Duergar, because we're going to be mentioning them again here in a moment. Moving on to our bard, I'm going to go ahead and say that the two best muses for dwarves are going to be the maestro and the warrior, especially since one of the gods that the dwarves serve is the Lord in Iron, a war-classed god. So it just makes sense to go with these warriors. But also, the maestro works rather well. Stereotypically, and if you listen to that opening, you know that dwarves and singing while they are mining away is kind of a funny trope at this point. So it just makes sense to have at least one or two bards to help pass the time in the mines. Moving on to our champion. Now, this one was a little tricky. The first one that came to mind was with the Hringas, the Tyrant cause, since these Duergar-esque dwarves are slave masters. So it made sense to go with the Tyrant. But what about any non-Hringas? Well, that's the thing. None of them really seemed to fit, though I think the Liberator would work for the occasional dwarf, since they are the exact opposite of the Tyrants. They seek freedom, and that was one of the things about the dwarves in their origins. All dwarves used to be underground, and Torag said that they would have to look for the surface when the earth began to shake. And it soon did. The event known as Earthfall. Now, most dwarves did surface, but the Hringas stayed below, and they became the slave masters that we know of them today. So, honestly, having a dwarf or two being a liberator and trying to free some of the slaves that these Duergar dwarves are keeping would actually make sense for a character. Moving on to our cleric. Now we can actually talk about the different gods. For your doctrine, you can either go with a cloistered cleric or a war priest. But in either case, I think it'd be best if we go over the different deities. We have Abadar, Angrad, Bolka, Caden Killian, Drangvit, Droska, Folgrit, Gorum, Grundinar, Kols, Magrim, Torag, and Trude. Now, only Torag was listed in the religion section of all the dwarves, but the rest of these dwarves are part of the dwarven pantheon. Well, at least Adrag, Bolka, Dragvint, Droska, Folgrit, Grodina, Kols, Magrim, Torag, and Trude are. But the others I just kind of happened upon, and this Caden Killian is a god of ale, alcohol, which some dwarves will serve. The main listed god, Torag, is known as the Forge Father. And his pantheons are of the Dwarven pantheon, as well as Demon Bringers, the God Claw, and the Laborer's Bastion. Just in case you wanted to look at any other gods that could indeed fit in line with Torag and his family pantheon, which is the Dwarven pantheon. If you would like to learn more about Torag or some of these other gods, I actually found a new channel known as Pathfinder. Philip, the YouTuber of Pathfinder, goes over each of the different gods within Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and at the end, near the end of each of his videos, he actually goes over what a character who follows that god might look like. The different ancestries that follow that god, the classes that they might take, and every so often even a subclass or two. So if you are looking for more Pathfinder 2nd Edition content, I would recommend checking out Pathfinder. Moving right along, we are going over to the Druid. And for our Druid orders, I think the best ones are going to be of Stone, Flame, and Wild. More often than not, you're going to see Stone, but some of the other types of Druids might end up going for Flame or Wild. Moving on to the Gunslinger. Looks like I forgot to put a comma in there, but either way, the two subclasses that would work would be the Way of the Trigger Brand and the Way of the Vanguard. Funny enough, the Way of the Vanguard is specifically listed to be made by the Dwarves. So, that's pretty cool. Moving on to the Kineticist. Probably not a common class to have for a dwarf, but for those dwarves who are Kineticists, the elements that would best fit them would be the element of earth, fire, or metal. Moving on to the Magus. For your hybrid study, the only one that made sense to me was the Inexorable Iron. I almost put the Twisting Tree on here, but it didn't make as much sense. Next is the Oracle, and some of these mysteries actually listed Torag and some of the other Dwarven gods in their description. So that is why I have them on this list. For your mysteries, the Mystery of Ancestors, Ash, Battle, and Flames would work perfectly for a Dwarven character. Moving on to Rogue. Another one that probably wouldn't be that common. In fact, I think it would only work if you used the Duergar as a character concept, but it would still work for the Mastermind or even the Ruffian. Ruffian probably could work for just about any dwarf, since they are a muscular, manly men who like to use strength to sort of get their way. Moving on to the Sorcerer. Again, not one that would be too common, but I think that the bloodline of the Elemental, using the elements of earth, fire, and metal would work. And then this one was actually mentioned by Philip from Pathfinder when he was talking about the god Torag. But the bloodline of the genie, using the genies of fire and earth, would actually be appropriate. And I sort of agree, since I think it was the Forge Dwarf was actually more closely aligned to the Plane of Fire. So having the Ifriti be a good sorcerer bloodline could actually make some sense. Moving on to the Swashbuckler, the only one that I thought would work for the Dwarves would have to be the style of the Braggarts. Since a lot of the time when we do see a dwarf, they are sort of bragging about some of their feats of strength or something like that. Next is the Witch. This one, take with a grain of salt here. The patron theme of the wild is more of a stretch than the rune, but I still think it would work. For the rune, dwarves have been known to etch different runes into their works. Their armor, their weapons, even some accessories for their beards have special runes, usually depicting their family and clan, or even some greater achievements. So that is why I picked the patron theme of the rune. And finally, we have the Wizard. Again, this one was a little bit hard to figure out, but I think the Abjuration and Transmutation Arcane schools would work for a Dwarven Wizard. Transmutation more often than not, since we are working with metals and other works. Being able to turn those different materials into weapons, armor, maybe even little toys for the children. Just something to think about. Now, with that being said, that is all the time I have for you today. What did you think? What type of dwarven character would you play as? Let me know in the comments section below. Until next time, this has been Drahon, and make sure to check out the channel Pathfinder. I'll make sure to have a link to their Pantheon playlist in the description below. But until next time, I am offline.